And then in high school, my brother had an acoustic guitar, and so we would go camping a lot, and I would take that because you can't take a piano or a bass, well, unless you have an acoustic bass,
Acoustic
but
bass.
they're,
It's not the
they're not
same, right?
they're not the most convenient, not the most convenient.
This podcast is about you and your journey in music and how you got to where you are now.
Cool.
Very cool. So first off, talk to me about where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised outside of Sacramento in a little suburb called Fair Oaks.
Okay. What was it like growing up there?
Suburban.
Okay.
But it wasn't quite what we think of suburbia as in now with strip malls and chains and stuff. It was like in Fair Oaks, it was kind of farmy, and there were like sometimes there'd be like a cow like in our street, like that kind of thing, and big fields of undeveloped land. So yeah, it was mellow.
Mm-hmm.
There's chickens.
Were you fairly close to Lake Tahoe or no?
Closer than Sacramento, like yeah, on the way from Sacramento to Lake Tahoe, but Lake Tahoe is still about, I don't know, it takes an hour and a half or so.
Okay. Yeah, I'm from way Southern California, from San Diego, but I spent some time up that way in Northern California. So
Cool.
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
so,
did you spend time in the Bay?
Yeah, I lived in San Francisco for about 5 years.
Yeah.
So I went to Tahoe a few times. Yeah, it's about 3.5 from there, but
yeah, we're kind of in the middle.
Yeah, you kind of drive through Sacramento to get up the mountain.
You do.
That's
yeah,
cool.
I spent a lot of time in the sort of foothills growing up, like getting outside all those the American River and like that area. I would canoe a lot and go camping a lot. So that area, that foothills between Sacramento and Tahoe, I spent a lot of time in those foothills, and it's pretty nice.
Yeah, it's beautiful up there. Well, so how did you get into music?
When I was a kid, my dad bought my mom a piano for Valentine's Day because he thought it was romantic, and I was about 7 or 8. My brother was a few years older, and so then we had this piano, and they were like, "Well, I guess we'll put the kids to lessons because here's the piano."
Yeah, the piano, right?
so that's how that happened. We I started around 8, and and just continued, never stopped.
Did you keep playing piano? Like, is that something that you continued with?
I continue it to this day. Yeah, it's like it's in my blood, and I still like practice classical pieces.
So are you classically trained then?
Yeah, eventually I went to college for classical piano performance.
Wow. Okay.
In outside of Chicago, and so that was it's always been it's been pretty deep in there, in my blood.
And obviously, I mean, you have guitars, banjos, everything up behind you. When did those instruments kind of?
Along the way, probably starting in I did piano since 8, and then in junior high, I started bass, and mainly because nobody played bass in junior high. It was like there were guitarists and there were like band instruments and pianists, but I was like, I want to play something that nobody's really playing. So I started bass in junior high, and then in high school, my brother had an acoustic guitar, and so we would go camping a lot, and I would take that because you can't take a piano or a bass, well, unless you have an acoustic bass.
It's not the same, right?
They're not the most convenient, most convenient. So I would borrow my brother's guitar, and I figured out how to play some chords on the guitar. So like all of those things kind of stemmed from the piano, but yeah, and then after and in college, I would play in different bands, from guitars and basses and keys, and so kind of multi depending on what a certain band needed. Yeah, that's.
Were you in the school band as a piano player or no?
In high school?
Yeah, or middle school, high school.
In middle school, I remember I was in the jazz ensemble, and I'm sure it sounded really terrible but it was a lot of fun.
Hmm.
And they had a pianist and they didn't have a bassist, like I was saying. And I started on like the keyboard bass. It was an old Fender
Oh,
Rhodes bass. And
that's rad. Like a
yeah,
guitar.
oh, well, it was like the vintage Fender Rhodes bass, which is super. They're rare and wonderful now. At the time, I was kind of embarrassed to be playing a bass part on a keyboard. Um, but now I definitely want one of those, and they're hard to find. Um, and that's when I started uh, bass. And then in high school, I also did bass and piano in sort of the jazz ensembles.
Oh, that's cool. Any
Yeah,
other bands like rock bands or
yeah. I
bands you
played
played
in
with? Okay.
played in garage rock bands with the drummer I still play with today, James
Really?
Neal. Yeah, so we kind of grew up playing rock and roll as a trio, piano bass, sorry, guitar, bass, drums, and in a garage, and that was high school rock and roll, and that was a lot of fun and formative. At the
Hmm.
same time, playing in jazz
Shows and stuff.
ensembles and stuff.
Would you
We
play
did we did
shows
a
then?
few shows
Okay.
around Sacramento. Um, I mean, high school, mainly like garages and parties and stuff. Well, more than clubs
Hmm.
when you're 16, 17.
Sure. That's
Yeah.
cool. And then you went to college for piano,
For classical
classical
piano.
piano, and talk to me about
Yeah.
getting into school. And I'm sure there's some sort of audition process. And
There is going to a conservatory was uh, was something I wanted to do, and I decided sometime my senior year of high school that I wanted to just learn classical piano. So that involved doing auditions and applying and sort of brushing up, or not brushing up, but like really practicing what needed to be practiced in order to get into the schools. Some I got into, some I didn't. I knew I didn't want to do classical piano as a performance for a living. I knew I didn't want to be a stage classical pianist, and I knew I didn't want to teach. Um, those are sort of the two main outlets for classical musicians, is
Mhm.
performing or teaching. And I didn't want to do either of those. I just wanted to learn classical piano. Like it was an art that I loved, and I wanted to learn it, and that's why I went to school for it. But and I had a great professor, Dr. Daniel Paul Horn, and he was formative for me. I After that, sort of my first year, I was like, I just was digging in, him and I had a momentum, and so 4 years of studying under him was really great for me.
When you said that you didn't want to teach it or play classical piano like on stage or whatever, what did you hope to achieve with the degree, or what were you hoping to do when you
Yeah,
finished graduation?
sort of unlike a lot of reasons why people go to college or school is, I mean, typically it's to do a career, right?
Right.
Um, I didn't want to do that, and I knew that going in, and I wanted to simply learn the skill as deeply as possible, for my own sort of artistic and tangible uh, sort of satisfaction, I guess.
Mhm.
Um, and I and that's what I did. And I don't teach and I don't play classical piano now, so I as a
Stuck to your
performance,
word.
yeah, that kind of worked out.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but you didn't know, like, did you? I mean, it seems like an awful lot of work for something that you didn't want to really pursue outside of it.
It's integral into who I am and what I do now, and
Hmm.
it is like a color in the palette of making music that I dip into all the time.
Hmm.
It Even when I'm writing uh, a rock and roll song, those roots are there and they're present and they come through, um, and it's always sort of a part of my output and how I view and create music sonically,
Hmm.
text, and that's not to say that what I make is always classically influenced. That's not what it is, and it's not complicated or anything like that. But it's still like it's me and it's who I am and it's how it comes out. in in my music, however in many forms. I mean, like even just knowing the theory of music and
Mm-hmm.
knowing what can or what has been or hasn't been done yet. Those yeah, it's all kind of part of what comes out. It influences
Sure.
me.
No, that all makes sense. I'm wondering, like, did you know that you wanted to write your own music and pursue a career like more of as an artist when you were there? And you were like, okay, well, while I'm here, I'm going to learn everything I can about theory and in classical piano, and I'm going to use all this in my toolbox to, try to pursue a career as like a solo artist or in a band, or was that kind of the hope after you finished?
You know, it kind of was, but it all, I don't know if that was totally in focus
Okay.
as a sort of destination for me. I wanted to, I was always like playing in different bands in different genres and in different sort of on different instruments
Hmm.
throughout the classical piano degree school. Throughout those 4 years, I was doing all sorts of stuff, and I was composing um, and writing my own stuff. So it was all kind of in the pot, mixed up in there. My
Hmm.
focus for going to school was classical piano, but around all those talented people and like just the energy of the creative energy around me that I found with friends, like I couldn't help but do all of the things. Um, yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your
No,
question.
it did. It did. And with that, like once you finish and you have your degree, what's like the next little stepping stone in your career? Like what kind of, what was the next track you took?
The next track I took, besides doing some, you know, office temp work because I
Okay.
needed to have a job after
Yeah,
school.
sure. Make some
You know,
money.
I needed to like pay rent, and I was living with friends in Chicago, and like life comes at you, and you have to do what you have to do
Hmm.
to pay rent. So like I worked at Chicago temp agencies for whatever day jobs they needed, and I collated papers and I got people coffee and uh, you know, that sort of, I input numbers. I was really good at inputting numbers on for documents for giant corporations that needed help and with that stuff. Anyway, did that for a while before
Uh-huh.
I found myself going to a studio nearby in Chicago. There was a mutual friend that owned a studio, and that's when that was a shift for me in terms of getting to know music production in the studio, getting to know
Okay.
microphones, getting to know preamps, getting to know compressors and outboard gear, and getting to know how to record things, and getting to know how to work with another player and have them hear the right things in their headphones, and how to capture it in the computer system. um, so I would just hang around this studio with this guy. It was just this guy, Mark Messing. He's awesome, very creative, and I would hang around, and eventually, and I'd just offer to help, um, sort of like an internship, but it wasn't an internship. I was just like hanging out and like hoping to learn stuff, and eventually he asked me to help him record something. So I was figuring out microphones and that kind of thing, and then eventually he asked me to help him write something. We would write for live theater or an indie film or even a corporate sort of industrial thing, and we do all this stuff, and I would just kind of help him and learn from him about sort of the music production,
Hmm.
and all the aspects of that, which was that was formative for me because as a musician, that's I mean that's not what I learned in college.
Hmm.
I didn't learn about signal flow and microphones and how to record stuff. I was just playing music. I relied on other people to do the recording, if they were in
Sure.
for engineering or whatever. So yeah, that was formative. It was hanging around with him, and then
Hmm.
eventually he hired me to just to be an assistant and to compose and record, and that was great. But that was the soon after college, in the few years following college.
Okay. And then you ended up what? Your first record was scoring a film, or you have a
Uh,
soundtrack?
No, I eventually moved to Los Angeles,
Okay.
um, and I did
To
some
pursue
tech
music?
to
What took you
pursue
to,
music.
okay.
For sure, Chicago. Soon after, soon after 9/11 happened, the economy took a turn, and things like paying for, things like music production and like the entertainment, like the whole industry in Chicago kind of shifted
Mm-hmm.
the economy. I mean, it shifted everywhere for sure. Um, but I wasn't able to sustain the job there. He had to let me go.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I wanted to do music. That's when sort of the focus happened for me was, some years after college, I was like, I really love the studio and I love figuring out how to record and capture and produce. So at that point, we moved to Los Angeles and opened up a credit card and had no money and put everything on a termed no interest credit card so we could afford to move, or not really afford it. That's not affording it. That's just like winging it. Yeah.
Rolling the dice.
And like I did temp work here because I didn't have a job, or anything like it, but I worked hard and I did a bunch of, I had an audio reel and I tried to find studios because there's so many studios here in LA, and the production, it's a bigger industry production wise. It was either LA or New York at the time. And LA is great. So and warm.
And it's in California, just
And it's
south
in
of you.
California.
It's not.
Yeah, I'm a California boy. So it was a matter of just trying to reach out to studios and see what I could land. And I was willing to do anything sort of production. I mixed audio for a cable network for a bit. I worked as an assistant, getting the vice president of Virgin Records coffee.
That's pretty rad.
Yeah. So did a bunch of stuff until I landed at a studio composing for them. And it was for a lot of it was for advertising at the time, and I knew I just wanted to compose in any sort of way that could possibly make a living. And that is, that's the branch of where I have been since then.
Okay. And is that what opened up Opus Orange? Like, when did you form that?
It did. It was about 2010. And Opus Orange was like, I remember when we moved to Los Angeles, I started opusorange.com as a way to show my reel to potential employers.
Oh, okay.
And so I would like load up some tracks onto the website, and it would be like a little about page, and I want to write so that people could potential employers or anyone interested in hiring me for anything had some sort of a reference website to go to.
Sure.
So that's what that started earlier on. And then eventually starting with my own, with sort of the Opus Orange as an entity, that was in 2010. And it came from being at this studio that was rad, and recording and sort of finding, I always wrote music, but like sort of finding an outlet, and getting to distribute music independently was starting to get a little bit more, not easier, just available, for independent artists, without a label and without sort of support, distribution, all that stuff that typically you needed in order to get your music out. So that's in 2010 is when we first sort of released an EP.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then when did you start seeing some traction with the project?
Traction's always, that's it's enigmatic for sure. because I mean, it's still like, I hope to someday get traction, and this is 11 years later. So
I mean,
you
you
know,
have songs with millions of plays.
yeah, I mean, there's traction on some songs, and there's I don't. It's hard to tell like how, if people are like just streaming the song randomly on a playlist anonymously, or if they're like invested in who we are and what we put out. So that
Mhm.
kind of thing is, it's a little enigmatic on the metrics, but with
Okay.
traction. Um, but we, early on from the first EP, we had some licensing opportunities, which was great. Um, I think we had like an Apple ad
Wow.
place one of the tunes, and then some like independent films placed some tunes from that first EP. So that was exciting and uh, fun.
Hmm.
Uh, and and then since then, uh, we would, I guess, around in 2014, um, we did about EP called Balance, and there's a song from that is definitely the sort of most streamed, or one of them. But Jeff Reagan at Sirius, what is it?
Alt Nation.
Alt Nation
Hmm.
played, somehow found it. I have no idea how he found it. I mean, we don't have a label. We don't have anyone like actively pushing our stuff, but he
Hmm.
found it and started spinning it on Alt Nation. Um,
Wow.
and that definitely got some traction. And I remember I didn't know this was happening until like weeks after, and I was like, "What? We're we're getting like played on a station that's rad and that has like listeners."
Yeah, listeners all over the whole country. I
Yeah, and
mean,
they
it's
would they
not
would
just
even
like a terrestrial single signal.
yeah, and they would announce who the band is. Like, they cared about pushing this stuff and seeing how it wasn't like a playlist where you don't know
Right.
who this band is, unless you really like it and you go to the playlist and look at the band and then click on the band. But like, yeah, the Alt Nation support was awesome. And that had traction at the time.
Hmm.
We haven't sort of done a song like that again. So like, you know, uh, the traction and momentum is enigmatic, and I I I'm grateful to Jeff and Alt Nation for spinning it, and
Hmm.
it was cool. It was exciting.
Like, where were you guys at when this whole virus hit?
Um, in last year, 2020,
Yeah, like in 2019 at the end of the year, did you have like big plans that were kind of squashed? Or were you working on object lessons
we
or?
released Miles from Nowhere right before sort of the lockdown in
Oh,
March.
really? Okay.
Yeah, I forget what month it was. Maybe it was like February or January or something of 2020 that we released the album Miles from Nowhere. Um, so we were trying to push that, and then the lockdown happened. And I mean, pushing things is like just screaming into the void of social media for us. That's how we do it. Um, and it is it's
I
not a
think that's how
success.
everybody does it, right? I mean,
Sure.
just
And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
yeah. And some people are feeding the beast, like
Yeah.
buying ads and all that stuff,
Yeah.
and some people
Yeah.
aren't.
Some people are, some people aren't. I mean, that's what, even if you have the support of labels and press and all that stuff, that does help. And they're, you know, doing a similar thing of shouting into the void, but using contacts and using
Mhm.
things that have
Some
value.
gatekeepers,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. But otherwise, it is enigmatic, the pushing of our music to as many ears as possible, uh, without sort of support. But
Mhm.
you know,
So you
we
put out,
navigate it.
yeah, Miles from Nowhere came out, and then
Yeah,
is Miles from San Clemente is a different record?
I just I follow energy wherever it goes. I follow momentum, and like Miles from Nowhere. Those songs were done, and I went on a I'll call it a surf trip, but I don't surf. I went on a surf trip with some friends that did surf, and we got
Okay.
an Airbnb down in San Clemente. And while they were all surfing, I had like my little my little acoustic guitar and this little USB microphone, and I was like, I don't know, I'm gonna sit around this Airbnb and sort of reinvent some of the songs that were on Miles from Nowhere
Okay.
in a in a in a sort of stripped down way. And so I was in this Airbnb and everyone was gone, and so I did a little project, and because of that, I'm as an independent artist, I can, you know, release whatever I want to and whenever I want to.
Hmm.
So that Miles from San Clemente, eventually I filled it out with a pedal steel player, Carlin, and some synths and vocals from Katie. But it was a kind of a stripped down sort of accompaniment of looking at some of those songs in a different vibe completely.
That's cool. And you recorded it. I mean, probably aside from the other additional vocals in the pedal steel in that Airbnb with just that
Yeah,
microphone. Oh,
yeah.
wow.
I brought like I brought like small things like a uke and like my little backpack, my little Martin guitar, and then a melodica. And so those are the things I had at the Airbnb, and then I tracked those there, and then came back and sweetened it a bit
That's
with
awesome.
pedal steel and the vocals and synths.
That's very cool. And
Yeah,
when
it
do
was
you
fun.
start working on object lessons? Because that just came out, right?
That did just come out. So that was we released um, Miles from Nowhere before the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
and then during the lockdown, I in my sort of bubble, my drummer James, and again we played in rock bands since high school. Um,
Real
we,
quick, did he go to Chicago with you or no?
he didn't. He did not. He did not.
How did you re-link up? Was he in
Back in
LA at the time?
he was in Sacramento, and then I came to LA, and eventually he moved to LA, and then started uh, collaborating again.
Cool. Sorry, off
Yeah,
track, but I was just
no, that's
curious.
great. That's great. But he sort of in my lockdown bubble
Hmm.
um, was was in my bubble. So we would go to the studio, the two of us, and we just have a real stripped down uh, studio here, and so we have some drums set up and some amps set up, and we would just play music, improvise music together, just with guitar and drums, and it, and we would do this regularly. We just needed some sort of like outlet during that time, especially in the first few months of it, and then out of that, I started recording uh, or getting to know how to record drums a little bit better. And because I couldn't get an engineer to, you know, I couldn't just bring more people into the bubble.
Hmm.
Um, I was the one engineering some of this stuff, and so I was I, experimenting with how to record drums better and improve that skill since I was since it was just the two of us.
Well, you had a
Um,
little bit. I mean, you obviously had some knowledge in that because you did
I I
you
I
know.
do have knowledge of it, but I'm not an engineer. That's not. It's good to know how to engineer, but like our main engineer Will Hampton, he's like an engineer, like in the proper sense. Like he whether it's soldering wires to like getting a good kick drum sound, like and how to finagle the sort of outboard gear
Hmm.
and in a real uh, analytical and tweaky and intuitive way that's not my skill. And I know,
Hmm.
a good engineer is a really valuable resource.
Sure.
um, we as musicians kind of hack through it, but there's nothing like a good engineer. um, but so in this case, without having a good engineer, I became the engineer, and I do know, signal flow and mics and stuff, but still like getting it really good and trying to improve, I guess.
Hmm.
I'm always trying to improve myself in some in some aspect, some way. So this was a sort of forced way to practice a skill.
Mm-hmm.
And so James and I were just in a groove momentum wise during must have been May and June and July, and out of that came all of object lessons, and it started with just acoustic guitar and drums, and that was sort of the root of all of these songs was that. And then eventually we, filling it out, I would, have sessions with just one person. After the drums and acoustic were tracked, I would just have sessions with I did send the bass player moved to Sacramento, and so we would work remotely for that. I sent him the tracks and he sent bass parts back, like that kind of thing. I mean, everyone was doing that, of course, during the lockdown. That's how, we as musicians found our outlets.
Right.
So yeah, that's how that was born. And, it had there's something it's definitely a band effort and sound that comes out of it. It's not programmed, it's not processed, it's not quantized. It's like, oh, okay, cool. It was fun to do, just like, I don't know, rock, for the lack of a better genre word. It's not really rock, but I don't know what it is. But it's a band, and that felt really fun.
Was that the first time you've written as a band in a while, or?
James and I really did find a groove together during this process, creatively and writing wise, and sort of part wise, and form, song form, and all that stuff. And it was one of the first times that was so sort of, the writing was so collaborative in that way. I love collaboration for sure. We did a soundtrack called Mile and a Half, in which Bernard Chadwick and it was totally collaborative. So the sound, we even hiked the trail that the film was about with the film crew.
Really?
Yeah. So it started collaborative, in the Mile and a Half soundtrack. So, and then when we got back to town out of the trail and they were making the movie, we collaborated completely on the writing and production of that soundtrack. So yeah, Object Lessons is not the first and won't be the last, but it was definitely not underthought, just really just intuitive, and we had a momentum and we followed it, and we didn't overthink. I guess it might have been underthought. We just didn't overthink some of the process, and we had a lot of fun making it, and it was kind of made quickly, and not to be quickly, but just because that's what felt right.
I'm curious on the soundtrack. So you tell me about this. So you walked the trail that the film was about. Talk to me about this whole film venture. I like.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. The John Muir Trail is, you might know it since you're in California, but it's part of the Pacific Crest Trail that goes from Yosemite to Mount Whitney, and then down to the Whitney Portal. And so the crew who became great friends, and they started in Yosemite, brought camera gear, brought sound gear in their backpacks for 20 some days. Bernard and I met them, over Kearsarge Pass, and we only spent about 8 days with them. And that finished the trail. So we got to summit Mount Whitney, and spend that time with them on the trail. I brought a ukulele because I could put it on my backpack. Bernard brought a glockenspiel, a toy glockenspiel, because that was light-ish. But yeah, and then coming back, the crew, started to started to form a documentary. And Bernard and I, sort of collaborated on the soundtrack along the production of the documentary, based on a lot of the stuff that was sort of improvised and written on the trail with them.
So it was, I guess I'm confused. So the film was a regular feature film, and then a documentary was formed based on the travel to shoot the film?
No, the film was and is a documentary.
Okay. Sorry, I was confused there.
That's all right.
Okay, so the film is documentary. You guys scored it alongside the crew as you were kind of hiking through the trail that the documentary was about.
Yeah, and then fleshed it out in the studio during the post-production.
Gotcha. Okay. Was it harder to, or I'm sure it's a lot different to write something like that versus a record of your own?
It wasn't hard. Momentum is important, and Bernard and I just had it, and it was like really locking, and we were writing this stuff, and it was fresh off the trail, and so like the momentum matters, and like we followed it, and it didn't seem like sort of challenging. It felt really natural and intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
And currently, I mean, the record's out. Are you playing live at all, or?
We toyed with it. There was like a window of hope of the lockdown, like, I don't know, 2 months ago.
Right.
We played at like a brewery, open aired brewery, Common Space down in El Segundo. Great friends and a great beer. Anyway, we did like this brewery show. That was the only live show we did, and then soon after that, it was like, hey, I think we shouldn't do this anymore. It kind of got weird again. And so we haven't booked anything, but we are starting to just get together every couple weeks and play music in a room. And that's really important to me. They're my best friends, and we all make music together. It's like, it's so sweet. And so we get together. We've gotten together a few times, but we're gonna get together just regularly now, and sort of dust off these songs and bring them back to life in a live way with the live energy. And so, we're all tired of live streams, but at the same time, it's a tool. Mm-hmm. It's a tool that has its positive some silver lining in them, but it is fun to just play music with your buds in a room. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're doing right now.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Yeah, I have one more question for you before I let you go. Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for aspiring artists?
Constantly create and keep momentum flowing. I think sometimes we as artists can have a tendency to hold things precious and to almost overwork them. And I would encourage anyone creating to like keep moving. If you write 10 songs, maybe one of them's good, but write 10 songs, maybe write 100 songs, and maybe one of them is good, but keep creating, and don't hold things precious. Bring me back